My name is Christina McClellan, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
I'm the Chief Curator at the University of Iowa Museum of Art, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Genegy Durham. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Journalism, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Welcome to the third season of Women at Iowa, a show that explores the work, experience, and history of women at the University of Iowa. I'm your host, Anna Bostwick Flaming, and our guest today is Rachel Williams, who is Associate Professor of Teaching and Learning and Art Education. She's also the 2009 winner of the Jean Jew Women's Rights Award. Rachel, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a real honor.
Well, so I know that you grew up in Eastern North Carolina and that you have your MFA and your PhD from Florida State University. How did you first come to the University of Iowa?
Well, I actually, I am a very lucky person, and originally I came to Iowa to teach at the University of Northern Iowa, and a job came up here, and I looked at the job and thought, boy, that would be a great job, but I don't know if I'm qualified for it. I don't know if I could actually do this job. It's a lot of pressure. And I called Steve Senator McGuire, who was the other person in the art education department, and talked to him on the phone, and he was a very inviting and wonderful, warm person, and we talked, and I thought, I would really like that job, but I don't know if I'll get it. And then I applied for it, and I was very lucky to get an interview, and then the interview went great, and I drove home and bawled the whole way home because I knew I'd never get this job because this job was just too, wonderful and great, and I just, was not in a position to take that kind of job yet, being right out of grad school. And I don't know what happened, but Steve offered me the job, and I was thrilled, and that's how I came to Iowa. So.
That's great. So a lot of your work in your career has explored the intersections of art education in prisons, and my understanding is that it was during a semester break before you started your PhD that you first volunteered at a nearby prison teaching art to women there. So what about that first encounter sparked your interest?
It's such a funny story because you just should say yes to everything because you never know where it's going to lead you. And so I went to the prison, and really that's where I learned how to be a good teacher, I have to say. I mean, I'd been teaching at a university, I'd taught high school, loved both of those settings, but when you have adult students who are there for the sheer joy of learning, rather than because they have to be there or because they're paying to be there in order to, earn a degree, it's a really different dynamic. And, I had never experienced that before, and I really loved it. They were some of the best students I've ever had. I continue to have some of the best students, in the prisons where I teach, and they are really there out of intellectual curiosity, and they're motivated by intrinsic, ideas, and it's a real honor to teach students like that. I hope everyone, that's a teacher gets that opportunity in their life. So I think that's one reason I continue to teach in prisons. The other thing about teaching in prisons is that coming out of art school, I was in a very cynical, point in time, and I thought, this is all, I just had a really jaded idea about art and the purpose of art in the world. And going into the prison, I was able to see that the women there made art because they needed to make art, and they wanted to make art, and they made art that was meaningful to them personally and to their families. And that was also really exciting and refreshing to see that, art is a real thing, that people really do have to make art, and that they gain a lot from that experience. So.
Tell me a little bit about the first day that you went there and how that went.
It was really interesting. I'd been teaching drawing for non-art majors at Florida State, and I had a very, I'd been doing this, I had taught it at least 3 times, really experienced. And so I had this big armload of books of, sort of classical images of good drawing. And and I had my box of donated stuff, and I thought, well, we'll do some real good drawing exercises. And first of all, the guard just ignored me. The officer just totally ignored me. I just thought, well, here I am, and I wasn't used to someone completely ignoring me. They were just on the other side of the glass, and just, I sat there and thought, well, eventually they'll let me in, and they did. And it was at Jefferson Correctional Institution, which is no longer a women's institution, and it was a huge prison. There was about 1,200 at least women there. And they had everything was painted Pepto-Bismol pink. So all the trim on all the buildings was pink, I guess to denote that it's a women's prison. And they had lines on the ground. And so the women who were incarcerated had to walk on one side of the line, and then everyone else had to walk on another side of the line. So that was bizarre, that separation. And then I also noticed, and every prison's different. So, when you describe the context of one prison, you can't assume that you're describing every prison. But I also noticed that there was not a particularly friendly relationship between the officers and the women who were incarcerated. And so that was a really uncomfortable situation for me. I'd never been somewhere where people were just that way to each other. And then I went into the classroom and sat down and started to, talk about what we're going to learn here in this drawing class. And, we're going to do these exercises, and showed them some images. And the women were bored to death. This meant nothing to them. They couldn't see any personal gain from this, and they were ready to go. And I sensed that. And I'm the kind of person who, I just say, this is not working. I'm a very upfront sort of teacher. And I said to them, I can tell you're really not interested in this, and that I'm really failing miserably. What can I do? And it was at that moment that I had this physical experience that was also sort of a metaphorical experience, where I was sitting behind this sort of desk. And I kind of came out and sat on top of the desk, and, we all kind of came together. And I said, well, what do you really want to learn? What do you think I could teach you? And they didn't have any art, so they, didn't have any preconceived ideas, which was really lucky for me. I didn't have anyone's shoes to fill, so I was very lucky. And they said they really wanted to learn how to paint portraits. And I said, oh, I can teach you how to paint portraits. We can do that, And that was meaningful, because if they could render a person in a realistic way, in a naturalistic way, that other people could recognize that person as a specific individual, they could use it as a commodity within the prison. So, you could say to me, oh, Rachel, will you do this picture of my kids so I can send it home to, grandma or whatever? And then I'll trade you cigarettes or stamps or, my canteen or whatever. So that was one thing. They could use this skill to barter for real goods. And then the other thing, too, is I think for them, that was the highest form of art. And so to be able to do that elevated their status as artists in the prison and sort of gave them that particular identity. And so one of the things for me teaching in prison is that I really want people who are incarcerated, who have been labeled as offenders or inmates or criminals all their life in some instances, to think of themselves differently, to create their own labels, and to see that this is only one tiny facet of their life. And we all do bad things. All of us do, whether we admit it or not. And so, if we were labeled by that one bad thing for the rest of our lives, oh, Rachel, you're a liar, or Rachel, you're a thief, and that was, always your label, instead of being able to create your own labels and really see your identity differently and see that you have a story to offer to the world about who you are and what you can do that isn't based on what other people tell you. So I think that that was the other thing, for them to have this opportunity to sort of elevate their status as artists and gain this skill. So that was my first day.
Wow.
It's pretty heavy.
So as you said, a lot of your work in prisons has been specifically geared toward women. Mm-hmm. I wonder, from your perspective, how do sex and gender shape the experience of prison?
I think they are shaped in massive ways. And I think one of the things about women's prisons in particular is that they're not necessarily set up for women, they're set up for men. And this has changed a little bit, but in many ways it hasn't. So one of the things, at the prison where I first began teaching, there were no women's clothes. All of the women, including the COs, wore men's clothes.
And COs
are correctional officers. Mm-hmm. They all wore men's clothes. And so, that for one strips away your identity, and that was incredible. I mean, to the point where a CO who was pregnant would have to wear a men's, shirt and figure out how to wear the men's pants. They belt him and put ropes and just try to work this out. And that's, that's not a good thing. And so they're really geared for men. And this is also true with treatment. Women who come to prison often have higher rates of trauma. They're often have longer and histories of sexual and physical and emotional abuse that may start in their childhood. And it's not that male people who are in prison who are men don't have that same history, but women have much higher incidences of that. They also tend to have come from very unhealthy relationships where they were often dominated by usually a male. And then they also usually are the primary caregiver of their children before coming to prison. So men who are incarcerated are not often the primary caregiver, so that when they go to prison, their children's lives remain stable. I mean, in some aspects, it's never good. The children are always victims in this whole cycle. But for women, sometimes those children have to be uprooted. If they can't go with a family member, they're shifted into social services or foster care, and that in itself is, also a track directly to prison. And so I think women come with a different set of needs than men do. And also women and men commit the same kinds of crime, but they do it at different at different instances. So most people who are in prison are in for nonviolent offenses. And so, you will often see women who are really, part of a bigger economic system that is not working for them. And so breaking the law is really one way that they can maintain some sort of economic status in order to, support their families or themselves. And there's also high rates of substance abuse, and I think there's definitely a link between self-medication and trauma, and not having mental health services in the community, and so being much more vulnerable to substance abuse.
So do you think that art education allows these women an outlet to explore some of those issues?
I do. I'm not an art therapist. People always say, oh, you do therapy? And I say, no. Art therapists are their very own, beings. They do something very different from what I do. But I think what happens in those spaces is that women are able to tell their stories, and as they hear themselves telling their stories, they learn about patterns of resilience. When I listen to the stories of some of the women with whom I've worked, I think, I just don't know if I could still be here, if I had lived through all of the things you've lived through, and you're still here, you're still managing to exist. And so they suddenly see those patterns of resilience. They suddenly see that the way that they dealt with particular situations really was extremely creative. They were extremely resourceful. So I think art education gives them a chance to hear their stories and think about what those stories mean and to make meaning. And every time you tell that story, the meaning changes, I think. And so I help women tell their stories through images, through spoken and written word. And I also think it's good for them to read the stories of other women, because they can see themselves in those stories, and they may not have had the opportunity to hear those stories of other women. And also in the prison, what's really interesting is, even though these women live together all the time, they don't know one another. And prison's a very dangerous place to sort of share and be intimate. And so I think that in creating a safe space, it's as safe as you can get. And there's all kinds of, a safe space in prison is an oxymoron. But to create a space where women can come and hear one another, they do hear stories and they say, I had no idea that you felt that way, or I had no idea that happened to you. That happened to me too, and so it builds bonds in ways that I think the regular life that they're able to live in prison doesn't.
So you've worked in prisons in places as diverse as Iowa and Wisconsin and Florida, even London. What are some of the differences that you've encountered both on an international scale and also within the States?
I think, one thing that's so interesting is prisons are very different. Each prison is extremely different, and so much of that difference is based on who the warden is, what the political climate of the state is, and what the current political climate is, in a national, global sort of way. And so, I think that's one thing. People always make these broad sweeping generalizations about prison, and they're all extremely different. I also think they all have unique sets of issues. So, if you live in a state where there's a lot of prisons, for example, Florida, and people get shipped all over, they aren't always close to their families, but I think geography can make a huge difference in how that prison works. I mean, for example, the women's prison in Iowa is the only women's prison. There's a unit at Oakdale, there's a unit at Mount Pleasant, but really that's the only women's prison. And so, it's in the center of the state, so you think about all the women that are on the fringe of the state and how far away that is. In London, it was shocking because all the women wore their own clothes. They all wore street clothes. So that was very different. And I think in some ways it saves the prison a lot of money. It also allows women to retain some of their identity. And you have a really diverse group of women who are incarcerated in the UK. And then they also were allowed to have their children with them at the prison. And I know many people think, what a terrible place for a child to grow up. And they only spend, usually prison nurseries, kids are there till they're maybe 18 months, sometimes 3 at the most, but they're not going to be very old. But in that setting, that child has, 50 mamas. And so the mother always has someone to help her, always has someone to say, I'll hold your baby. And there's always someone watching how she mothers and saying, you could do that better. And so those children are really well taken care of. I mean, they grow up in really bleak places, but they're very loved, which I think is important. The other thing that was interesting about the UK is that they had juvenile offenders. They had young women as well as older women there. And I think there's a lot of issues, whether that works or not, in terms of those women becoming victimized or re-victimized. But in some ways, those women also had mentors that they didn't have otherwise. And sometimes the mentors were very positive, and obviously there's also some negative things there. But there's some real differences, I think. I've seen places that are extremely punitive. The prison I described, Jefferson, where I first went, the 2 tracks for people, the women there all had to have jobs, and so they didn't have enough jobs for every single woman to do something, so they had these women they would send out to the fields, like the grassy areas to pick all the clover out of the grass, things like that. So they would sit in the hot sun in Florida picking clover out of the grass for hours and hours, and that was their job, Whereas at Iowa, Iowa has a much more progressive system, I think, in terms of the women's prison. And part of that is due to the legacy of the wardens that have been there for the last 10 years or so. They're very progressive, women-centered wardens. They're both women. Diane Wilder Tomlinson is a woman, obviously, and then Patty Walkendorf, who's the current warden, is also very gender-specific in terms of programming. And so the women there, it looks like a girls' school. There's much more sort of physical freedom. The relationships between the COs and the women who are incarcerated are not, for the most part, adversarial. It feels really different. Techeetah, which has changed drastically since I did my research there, the warden that was there was, I don't know if she was fired or let go, but many years ago it was a really tough place, and the women lived in pretty rough circumstances. They had just opened a Supermax part of the prison, and so that was a really different experience, and the women that were there were really experiencing a lot of psychological isolation, and you really need human contact, and so that was really tough. And then they're just very different across the country and across the world, I think. So
talked a little bit about doing research in prisons. I wonder, what do the women prisoners that you work with think about your research? Do they read it? Do they know about it?
Yeah, they do know about it. They have read it, and often my research is based on their stories. So I do a lot of interviewing, and so we'll sit down and talk, and then I'll go back the next week and say, okay, this was the story you told me. This is the part that I'm really interested in. I'm interested in motherhood and how that works for you, or I'm really interested in how art functions in your life. And so they're very clear about what I'm doing. And then obviously we have the IRB here at the University of Iowa, and because of those protocols, you have to be extremely upfront, with the people with whom you're working. And then for the sort of creative scholarship that I do at the prison, the women are very much collaborators. So one of the classes we did, we produced a DVD, and all the women, I came in and recorded them. They heard their recordings. They said, this is what I think should change. I don't like this part, take this out. And then those recordings were given to them to give to their families. And then they were also sent to libraries around the state. So that to me is a very collaborative enterprise. And while I'd love to have them in the editing room with me, I can't do that. But I try to be very open about, what I'm doing. And then sometimes when I take all of those interviews and come up with themes, instead of telling the story of specific women, because women, based on their stories, sometimes can be fairly easily identified. And so sometimes I'll make sort of a composite figure that is in the research that sort of illustrates the theory that I'm trying to talk about. So I would take many stories of women and weave them together. So
what have you learned by working with prison staff?
I think people have really very stilted ideas about people who work in prisons, and I would say that some of the staff who I've met in different prisons are extremely progressive, very human-centered, very caring and interested in helping people. The thing that's interesting about Iowa, and especially ICIW, is many of the staff have been there for years and years, which says to you this is a good environment. And it's just like any profession. You have stinkers. You have people who are not there for particularly altruistic or good reasons. But for the most part, I think, they also have a difficult situation. They work and in many ways spend more time behind bars than they do out in the regular world. So, if you talk about someone who's worked in a prison for 20 years, they have some things, like they want to know where their keys are all the time. They don't like the sound of doors locking behind them, or they want all the doors to be shut. So, there's some psychological consequences for people who work in prisons as well. I think, I often work with the people who are in education or in counseling or treatment in the prisons, and they have a completely different job than the people who are COs. But, I think for the most part, people who work in prisons find that if they treat the people who are incarcerated there with respect, and they try to help them maintain dignity, and they understand that they have needs and they work to help them meet their needs, their job is going to be much better. And I think, most people who stick figure that out pretty quick. So
in 2007, you won a grant to explore expanding arts education in juvenile detention centers. What did you learn by working with youth in that setting?
Well, the Roy J. Carver Foundation was extremely generous, and they are very interested in young people and in arts, among other things. But I taught high school for years. I love teenagers. I love them. They are so interesting and so much fun and so creative, and they can just be so invigorating to work with. So I really like working with teenagers. So I've always worked with the juvenile home, the girls' home in Iowa, and it's a fantastic place. I mean, just like anything, they don't have enough money to do all the things they want to do. The legislators, continue to cut their budget or underfund them, which I think is a comment on gender in Iowa, as well as the state of juvenile justice in our state. But they had a great art teacher. They had two good art teachers, but they didn't have the resources to do the kind of work that they wanted to do. So one of them I spoke with, and he was a photo teacher, and he had, like one camera, one printer, and maybe 2 computers. And, when you have a class of 20 girls teaching photography, that is just not going to work. So I worked with him, and we built a small digital photo lab and where they could do video and photo. The other art teacher wanted to expand what he could offer, and so we really worked on getting him some supplies that he could use, and also helping him to build a curriculum. And the teachers in juvenile homes have a really difficult time because the kids are always cycling in and out, so it's not a regular school year. So they might have someone for 3 months, they might have someone for 2 years. Those kids come from very diverse educational backgrounds. Oftentimes, by the time a child has been in juvenile it is put in the juvenile justice system, they've had, between 9 and 20 foster care placements. And so oftentimes with those foster care placements, their school placements change. So they have a really uneven educational background. And at the state training school, Tom Christensen worked there, and he is a fantastic Iowa artist, and he wasn't there to teach art. He was a staff person there, and he would teach art to some boys who were interested. They would say, I want to learn to do what you do, and so he would come and take time out of his regular day, or come when he was off work to teach them pastels. And he was doing this in this dingy little awful corner. And the state training school has incredible athletic facilities, but they don't. Again, they're underfunded, and so they didn't have any art. So I was able to get them a kiln and build them sort of a ceramic studio with some wheels and some nice things. And then we also built a drawing studio. And they were extremely responsive to this, and they hired an art teacher who had retired from the local high school to come in and teach art half-time. So that was really exciting to me. And I thought just to offer those children the opportunity to do something other than sports is pretty, special. So I really felt really good about that project, and I still feel good about the work that they're doing.
So you've published quite a lot about art education in prison, but in particular I want to ask you about the anthology that you published in 2003, Teaching the Arts Behind Bars. What did you learn from the experience of putting the book together?
Well, I did it initially because often many of us work in isolation, especially artists who teach in prison. There's a fair network of us, but there's not many. And it's also the kind of thing people do behind the scenes, so you may not realize even that there's another artist at the prison. And I didn't have a clue as I told you when I went in, and I said, gosh, I really wish there had been a book I could look at. So I decided this will be a really fun project. I'll get to meet other artists who do this work, and I'll get to sort of create this resource for other people who want to teach in prisons. And well, I mean, I knew this already, but artists are extremely generous and very willing to try and do things. And so it was really fun for me to look across the country and say, who is doing this work, and whose work do I respect a great deal, and who would I like to get to know better? And so I was really, I was able to talk to Buzz Alexander, who is one of my heroes, Grady Hillman also, Judith Tannenbaum, who is amazing. So Susan Hill, another person who's amazing. Like, there's just Leslie Neal. I mean, I could just go on and on. So that was really a great opportunity for me, and especially as a young scholar, to sort of reach out and say, what are other people doing, and what do you think about this? And most of the people who asked to be part of that anthology had far more experience than I had, and so I learned a lot even from talking with them about, what does this mean and what can you do? And so in some ways it was almost like this sort of consciousness raising experience to be able to talk to people and learn about this.
So you've also mentored quite a few undergraduate and graduate students in developing their own prison projects. What advice do you give to them about starting a program and maintaining a program? Sure.
I think one of the most important things is to go and volunteer somewhere just to feel it out. Find a way to go in and work there for a little bit under someone else, just to see what the situation is, to see what people need. That was one of the things I didn't do that first time. I had no idea what the real needs were. So I would say do that first, and figure out what it is you can contribute well, and also what your limitations are. So how manageable would this program be? How long can you sustain it? Can you make a commitment to go on a regular basis? All of those things are important. So I have so many great people I could think about. 3 young women come to mind. One is Natasha Hovey. She has been one of my iCrew students, and she's worked very closely with the juvenile home for the past 2 years. And she has helped them to get this show that they've produced called Art and Trauma across the state and out. And she's been working on their catalog now. And so I think and then she spent a year teaching under Gary Olson, who was one of the best art teachers ever. And he was also an art therapist, so really well suited to work in the juvenile home. But she worked with him for about a year, and I think she learned a lot about, working with girls and boys. There's a few boys there too. So she's been amazing, and she now is going to graduate school, and she's found that she's extremely desirable because she's had these experiences. And so graduate schools are really looking at her and going, wow, you did this and you did this, and she's done many other things. So she's one. Rebecca McCrae is one of my favorite stories. She was an English major here, and she came to me and said, I think I want to do this. I'm not really sure. What do you think? And I said, well, why don't you come with me? So she came and worked with me on this project called Women in Exile, and where she taught writing. And then she loved it, and she said, do you think I could do this? And I said, of course you can. So she taught photography at the juvenile home, and then she also taught writing at the women's prison, did a poetry journaling bookmaking project. Great. Really got involved and interested in these issues. And she moved to New York when she graduated, and she is now working for the ACLU. And one of the things she works on in particular is women who are incarcerated and their issues. So for her, I think it really changed her life. She also had an impact on me. I mean, I think that's the other thing about teaching, is it is a reciprocal relationship. So you gain as much from your students as they gain from you. But she came into my life at a time when I was really considering sort of trying to not do prison stuff anymore, because I'd been doing it for so long, and I was kind of feeling sort of burned out a little bit. And she really reinvigorated my enjoyment and enthusiasm for it. So that was really exciting. And then the other person is on campus still. She's working on her MFA, Lisa Johnson. She came with me for a couple of times for this Women in Exile program, and then she started her own program at the women's prison called the Eva Luna Project, which is a storytelling, theatrical writing project. And it is great guns. I mean, she has a waiting list, for women who want to participate in this, and she does it every year at the prison. And so I think that's been also a big impact on her life as well. So, it's really inspiring and it's exciting. And right now I have a wonderful woman who is my prison partner, Jeffrey Palermo, and she goes with me all the time. And it's it's so fun to sit in the car on the way back and forth and say, oh, this is going on. What do you think? And then this year I also had this great opportunity through the Women's Studies program, Gender, Women, Sexuality Studies here on campus. They asked me to teach their practicum class. And I said, I have this really funky idea. What do you think? And Jennifer Glass, who's the head, said, go for it. This is great, you know. So I take the women studies students to do their practicum at the women's prison. And we formed a think tank. So the think tank is comprised of half of women who are incarcerated and then half students. And the first semester, we kind of came up with this list of ideas that we wanted to tackle through research and through reading. And they were motherhood, substance abuse, and health care. The semester ended. All of my women's studies students said, we want to keep going. Can we do an independent study with you next semester? And then they brought a friend. So, you know, the think tank is still going. Women's studies, the GWIS department is still supporting this, which is I'm so thankful for that. And so every Friday I have this van load of women from the University of Iowa, and we go up there and we meet women who are in prison and we work on these issues, and it's so exciting. You know, it is really one of the highlights of my week. And I feel like that project is going to actually make some real changes in the prison. And the prison's very open and receptive to this. So it's a pretty exciting experience.
So this year, in 2011, you became a co-director of the Obermann Graduate Institute in Engagement in the Academy. So what kinds of lessons about bridging scholarship and engagement do you try to convey?
I was so honored to be part of that, and I was really lucky because my co-director is Ken Brown, and he had taught me just a tremendous amount about very, you know, simple things, just organization, for example. Like, I am not a very organized person, and so working with him was great. But I think one of the things I try to convey is that, you know, you have to always ask yourself, why do I want to do this? And what do I hope to get from this, and what do I hope to give? So I think that's one thing. And I also think, you know, again, it's good to go in really without ideas, without preconceived ideas, to go in and be in these spaces outside of the university and say, you know, what's going on here? What are the really good things, to try to see the positive things that are happening in those community spaces, see what their needs are, and see if you can help to fill any of those needs. I think those are really important things. I also think, you know, as scholars, you have to find out what feeds you. And for me, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with love, which sounds really goofy and mushy, but, you know, I think we are all interdependent on one another. And I think to act as though our work only, you know, affects what happens in the university is a really short-sighted way to see scholarship. And I don't think most scholars think of themselves that way. I think most scholars think about how their work reaches out beyond the ivory tower. So I think, you know, it's really good to see what is going on in the world and to be in that world, you know, to get your hands dirty and be in the nitty-gritty of things. I think that's really enjoyable. And I also think you can make amazing changes, you know, that can really have a broad impact. And as scholars, we are in a very privileged position. You know, we have resources that many people don't have. We also have, you know, this particular status in some instances that can also be very helpful in making change and having people actually listen to us. So, you know, that's a pretty exciting and important thing. But I think, you know, a lot of it really is to go out there and see what's going on and do something about it. So what do you not like about the world? What can you change? And the other thing I think that's important to convey about that work is this idea of loving yourself too. And so not burning out and finding out what feeds you and in what, you know, what amounts, you know, how do you moderate your life and balance your life? And I haven't quite figured that out myself yet, but I'm hoping other people will. So.
Wonderful. Well, in 2009, the University of Iowa Council on the Status of Women and the Women's Resource and Action Center awarded you the Jean Y. Jew Women's Rights Award for your outstanding effort or achievement in improving the status of women at the University of Iowa. What does winning that award mean to you?
Oh, it was huge. It was huge. I was so honored. You know, one of the things I love about working here is that every day I meet someone on this campus who blows my mind, you know, who I think, wow, I work at the same university as that person? That's amazing. And this happens all the time. You know, I mean, I feel like, you know, I meet rock stars every single day. And so Genegy, for me, is one of those people. You know, I've been in a couple meetings with her, and I know I've sat there going, oh, you know, I really admire what she did. But also, when you look at the list of women who have won that award, it blows my mind. You know, like, we have amazing women on this campus. And so to be in that company, I was honored, really honored. And also, I really appreciate the work that the Council on the Status of Women has done at this university and continues to do at this university, and also the Women's Resource and Action Center. I think those are two big parts of this campus that make me continue to like being here and continue to feel connected. So I was really honored to have that award, and I felt very undeserving in many ways. But it was really the highlight of my really career here. And if you come into my office and you look at what's on the walls, and I have all kinds of stuff on the walls, I have a lot of art from my friends and students. The only thing I have framed that is a diploma or certificate is that certificate. You know, that means more to me really than any of my diplomas. I don't even know where they are. But that certificate is framed and hanging on my wall because it just means the world to me.
So in addition to all of these other things that you do, you keep up with your own art as well. Mm-hmm. I know you've done a series of paintings that explore the concept of war. Mm-hmm. What are you up to now?
Well, right now I'm really having this wonderful experience. I'm having a lot of fun. I really like comic books, and I really like graphic novels. And there are so many good ones out there about social issues. And so right now I'm working on a series of comic books with the Chicago Freedom School and the Whole House related to juvenile justice. So
cool. And specific things involving race relations, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I also have done a couple of pieces on the 1898 Wilmington race riots, which was the only coup that's ever happened in this country. And there was a cartoonist who was very influential in that movement called Norman Atherogenic, and he really, for all intents and purposes, has fallen off the map. And so I just wanted to sort of bring his work to light and also talk about how powerful his work was in relation to making some just horrible things happen. So
I know you've described the birth of your children mm-hmm. and the experience of being a victim of violent crime mm-hmm. as significant events in your life. Mm-hmm. I wonder, in what ways does your personal life affect the way that you approach your work?
Well, I think, again, this idea of love, of course, I love my children, but having children really made me understand how special and how precious every single person is in this world, and how, even just coming into the world, you are lucky to get here, and then once you are here, so many things can happen. All of us can be so vulnerable, and so I think, really understanding that every single person has someone somewhere who loves them and thinks that they are very special. And so if we could all see one another in that light, I think it would really make a big difference. I really believe in that. And so I think the other thing is that people change so much in their life, and I really like watching people grow and change. I mean, this is one of the things I love about teenagers. I get to see them when they're teenagers, and then 10 years later I see them again and think, I knew you were going to be special, But in terms of working with students here at the university and also working with people who are incarcerated, I think understanding how special every person is and that everyone has something really significant to offer really is important. So
it's a Women at Iowa tradition
mm-hmm.
to ask all of our guests to recommend a book that will help us to better understand your point of view.
Sure.
What would you add to our list?
Well, this is a really tough question because I love to read. If you came to my house, you would see that my house is held up in many ways by the books I have. Probably one of my favorite authors for this particular idea is Annie Dillard. And, she's written so many great books. The Living is a really good book about how hard it is to live and be alive. Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek is beautiful. And then The May Trees is also another great book about love and relationships. So I would say anything by Annie Dillard will be a good thing. And then For the Time Being is another one of my favorite books. So anything by her I think would be great.
So you're a woman at Iowa. Mm-hmm. What advice would you give to other women at Iowa watching?
I would say to try everything. To really follow your heart. If you are really interested in something, pursue it, whether it's in your discipline or not. And then also to reach out to other women. You know, form a community of women that can support you. I've been very lucky to have incredible colleagues who are extremely supportive, both women and men. And so I would say, you know, build a network around you of love, and figure out what you love and what you can do, and do those things. And always try new things. Say yes. See what happens. So.
Good advice. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of Women at Iowa.